So now, it is my honor to introduce another dynamo to the stage because Ms. Steinem has agreed to have a conversation with us to answer some questions that have been posed. And it is my honor to pull up to the stage Alberta's 14th Premier, who was sworn into office in October of 2011. She's been very active on the provincial and national stages of politics since the 1980s. She served in a variety of capacities, the office of the Prime Minister of Canada, in Africa with the European Union, and back in Canada as Secretary General of the United Nations. Who do you think I'm talking about? She's like the first female Premier of Alberta. It's such a female trait. We do this. And Premier Redford, you are the Premier. And so it's such a female trait, you know, oh, stop. But you are a Premier, and it's wonderful to have you here with us tonight. So,
it's a privilege.
Okay. Now, these questions that have been posed tonight are being asked by staff members of the YWCA. And we have some staff members who are here with us tonight. Another donor bought a table and gave it to the YWCA so that some staff members could be here tonight. So where are you, the staff members? Give us a wave. I can't quite see them, but... And so, staff members at the Y have compiled this list to start our discussion tonight. So, here we go. You ready? You both are tremendously accomplished women by any standard. How did you realize that you were meant to be someone who would make a difference in the world?
Well, you know, it's funny. I often get to speak to class groups and to young women and young boys, and they'll say, how did you end up with the job that you have? And I have no idea how I ended up with this job. If I think back to what I was doing in my 20s and in my 30s, I don't think I would have thought that I would end up here. But what I say to them is that I think I always followed my passions. I don't know why, as I was growing up. Well, I do. I remember as a kid, my grandpa was a Scottish immigrant, and he'd worked in the coal mines in Scotland and came to Canada in 1948. Had always been involved in this community, and I think watching him, I knew that he was someone who always helped people. He took care of people. He was involved in his church. He and my granny had a grocery store, and I know they always kept accounts that actually never got paid. But they always helped people. And I think growing up, I knew that it was important for us to do that in different ways. So when I think about when I was in my 20s, I was attracted to political leadership that had those values. And I got involved in different ways because I really wanted to support the idea that we all needed to come together as a community to help people, to understand that people don't always end up in situations through any fault of their own. And that as a community, we need to be able to come together to make community better. And I think it was about following passions. And very often, I think it was probably about knowing that it was okay to not conform. And that's not always easy, but certainly something that I've thought about in my life a lot. So.
I think, well, following passion, absolutely. I mean, it's so important that we do what we forget what time it is when we're doing it, and you know, because I think that's how we know our internal talents that each of us uniquely has. But obviously family, as you say, is absolutely crucial, and we do what we see, not what we're told. And I remember my mother telling me about the Depression, and every time the word Roosevelt came to her lips, tears came because he had saved us from the Depression. So I had some idea that the public system related to my private life. And also, I had one event or a series of events in my life that I didn't think was lucky at the time, but was. I didn't go to school very much until I was about 12. So I missed a big brainwashing and sort of Dick and Jane and Well, who knew? You know, I just read the Hardy Boys and Nancy Drew, and I read. And I think that's quite helpful. But I also think that, speaking for myself, I belong to an unplanned generation. I mean, we did not look forward and see what our future will be. And what's so exciting about so many of the young women I've talked to here tonight is that they see their future. They plan their future. And that is, some smart sociologist said that planning ahead was the only reliable measure of class. You know, that rich people plan for 3 generations forward, poor people plan for Saturday night, you know. And, and by that measure, as so many others, women, even in very well-to-do families of inherited wealth, still don't feel they can control their future. They think their husbands and children, you know, will make those decisions. Now there are several generations of women who plan forward and say, here's where I want to be in 10 years, and here's what... That is revolution. That's wonderful.
So the next question kind of relates to that. If you could send a message to your 20-year-old self, what would it be and why?
Well, I have a 10-year-old daughter, so I think about that question a lot. And I think that when I think about growing up, and I think about what I would have liked to have known, I think a lot about resiliency. Because I think that as young people now, there are many people that are parented and have been parented to think that they will be successful, they can be successful, that, you know, maybe if they don't get that score in the soccer game, that it was a result of outside circumstances. I think it's important for us to know, as it would have been important for me to know as a young adult, that you may not always succeed, but as long as you're resilient, that you've got an opportunity to overcome that. And I think the other thing is truly, and I thought about it in the context of the first question, that you really have to have a sense at whatever age you are as to what you think, how you feel, and not be afraid to challenge ideas, to not become a victim of groupthink, and to be able to think about whether or not what is going on is fair and honest and reasonable, not just for you, but for everyone in your community. I think that's very hard for young people ever to have confidence in, but I think it is about resiliency and having some sense of confidence in your own thoughts and ideas, and to know that there are people out there that will trust your thinking at that age, and that your opinion when you're 20 years old matters just as much as when you're 30 or 40 or 50. That's important too.
Well, since I'm much older than the Premier, I would have been saying to my 20-year-old self, you don't have to get married. Yeah. You don't have to. Because I mean, I went on thinking, you know, for at least another 20 years, or, well, I don't know, when did the women's movement come along? Yeah, almost, maybe 15 years, that I had to do certain things. And so I would say to myself, okay, I'm doing it, just right now, not right now, you know, in that way.
But, you know, it's funny you say that, because you referred to the fact that I have an ex-husband, and I got married when I was 23, and I think even he would agree that that's what I should have told myself.
See, I rest my case. But I guess aside from that, I would have just said to my 20-year-old self, it's going to be okay.
Okay. How important is it that the vision for a movement or a change be shared amongst individuals or organizations? Talk about what has been effective or ineffective in communicating a shared vision.
Why don't you go first on that one?
Well, I think the most effective thing is telling the truth. I mean, as we have said in many ways tonight, you know, that, and not whispering it, you know, I mean, that is, we are made to feel that we're experiencing something that is our fault, or it's only happening to us, or something is wrong, and only when we say it out loud do we discover that there are all these other disparate people who had some version of the same experience. So if such different people had the same experience, it's probably political, and if we come together, we can share it. And I don't know any big social justice kind of movement that hasn't started that way. Whether it was speaking bitterness in China, or whether it was the civil rights movement in the U.S. South and people testifying in black churches, or whether it was women within the civil rights and the anti-war movements who loved those movements. We loved those movements, but we were still making coffee and mimeographing. There's a word from the pen. So we'll explain to some of you in the audience. But only when we started to speak this, discover the shared experience, and begin to act on it. And that's, I think, how all movements begin. Otherwise, I don't think you want to have conformity or uniformity. If you've experienced something, you're more expert in it than the experts, usually. Yeah. But we want to be able to speak diversity, and we're not trying to pick each other's issues, what's most important, because we're most effective on what we know the best.
Did you have something you wanted to say?
Well, I think that something that I've seen lately, and I think it does ring true from other things that I've seen in life, is that you can never presuppose someone else's life. And so that's why it's so important to talk about these issues, because you don't know what someone is experiencing behind closed doors. You can't presume if someone is wealthy that they're not experiencing the same thing as someone who's living in poverty, whether we're talking about drug addiction or mental health or domestic violence, even parents that are dealing with children, even with health conditions. And so it's important to have a public conversation about those issues so that people that are sharing those common experiences can come together and be open about what their values are. And I remember this when I first became the Justice Minister, and we talked about the Safe Communities agenda and about how so much of the work that you were talking about tonight around social justice and inequality and crime prevention was about understanding that we had to look at early childhood development, what was going on in families, how domestic violence would impact bullying, how that could lead to mental health and drug addiction issues. And what surprised me when I first became a politician and I went around the province and I talked about it, is you could never presume who was in the audience. You know, you could be in rural Alberta, or you could be in northern Alberta, or Calgary, or Edmonton, or religious communities, or groups of men or groups of women. And when you talked about these common themes, inevitably you'd have someone come up to you and say, you know what, that happened to my neighbor, or that happened to my family. I have a son, I have a daughter. And so being able to talk about these issues in a way that lets people come together is really important, so that we're not whispering about any of those issues, and we're able to say that we as a community acknowledge that we have those problems that we've got to resolve. And some of the speeches tonight talking about some of the statistics that we have in Alberta, I think are a bit of a legacy of the fact that we haven't done a very good job of that for some time. And it's important to have events like this where we're talking about those issues, understanding that they're connected, and that they are going to take some time and they're going to be complicated to resolve, but that we have to do it so that we can move on to a better place. I think that's important.
I would just add that it's not all sad or negative, it's about allowing ourselves to pace ourselves. You know, it's not all about. So I mean, if we want to have music and poetry and joy and sex at the end of the revolution, we have to have music and joy and poetry along the way. Otherwise, we won't have it at the end. And also, here's something I've discovered lately, which is that laughter is the only free emotion. It's really revolutionary. I mean, you can compel fear, of course. You can actually compel love, too, if someone is isolated and dependent for long enough to survive. They come to believe they're in love, but you can't compel laughter. It's two things come together and, you know, and make a third thing, and it makes you laugh when you learn something. I mean, Albert Einstein, who could not possibly have said everything he was supposed to say. Anyway, he said that, I think he said that he had to be extremely careful when he was shaving in the morning, because if he thought of something new, he laughed and cut himself. So I just think we need to appreciate it all, you know, and make it communal.
And the other thing is to celebrate success. It's important to know that there are those successes along the way, and sometimes they're individuals, just one person. Those 173 people that graduated from the skills development program that we talked about today, those are great successes for them and their families and the community. Yeah.
Our next question has to do with values. Do you think that they have changed since the 60s and 70s and over time? Do you think values change?
Yeah, well, I don't know values. I mean, I think we thought things in the 60s that turned out not to be true. Do you know what I mean? I mean, I think we thought, I have to say I didn't myself. I'm too Midwestern for that. But but people thought that a violent ends could reach a peaceful end. I mean, if violent means could reach a peaceful end. And I don't think that's true, actually. I think the means are the ends. And we thought about joy in terms of escaping, or in terms of drugs, or rather than presence. So I don't know if that's values exactly, but behavior and understanding has changed.
You know, I wonder if, when I think about different periods of history in North America, I'm not sure if values have changed, but I think how we talk about values and what we truly value has changed. You know, and I think of, and for me it is, I was born in 1965, so this could just be a bit of a generalization, granted. You know, I think about a lot of what we heard about, or what I heard about in the 1950s, where you had women who were living at home, raising kids in traditional marriages, you know, who drank martinis and played bridge all afternoon. I think they probably had a pretty good sense of who they wanted to be and what they wanted to do, but there wasn't a society that allowed them to do that, so that's how they coped with the fact that they couldn't fully participate and engage in the way that they want to. So I'm not sure if values have changed, but perhaps the way that we talk about how we value people might have changed. But I also think it's important to say that we should ask people to challenge their own conventional thinking and values, and to know that there are people that really cling to those. And that is not I don't know if it's values or if it's approaches to life, some of those family structures that you talk about, that are very dangerous for their own families and also for the community.
Yes, I'm thinking obedience and loyalty to, I mean, sometimes family is not, healthy for an individual. Sometimes you really have to move on. And we have to have new concepts. Chosen family, I think, is a wonderful concept. And friendship, it turns out, they measure this for women, but I bet it's true for men too, that female friendships consistently lengthen one's life as much as stopping smoking. You know, that the value of, we're communal creatures, you know, right.
So when you talk about that and you talk about family structures and that sort of thing, I start to think about people in gay relationships, and maybe values have changed, because certainly people have lived gay lifestyles for many generations and for decades, but the way that we as a community are prepared to talk about that and accept isn't the right word, but be open to those different forms of family and structure and lifestyle is different. So maybe it means that leadership has asked community and challenged communities to think about what our community values are. I think basic values around human rights and respect, I hope, are the same, but maybe we have challenged conventional thinking in terms of the way that we as a community need to be open to different values.
Yes, in that way we certainly have. And, you know, we have very authoritarian folks in both of our countries who speak about values in a very authoritarian way. You know, that sexuality is only for having children and therefore, all these other things.
Yeah.
And that has certainly changed a lot, right? We understand it's the content, not the form of a family, right?
That's right.
The next question is a little bit longer, so I'm going to read it. Recently here in Canada, Parliament came close to reopening the debate on when human life begins. In the United States, candidates were making comments around legitimate rape and binders full of women. Men out-earn women and still hold the lion's share of elected offices and executive roles. As the YWCA can attest, women are more likely to live in poverty, to be lone parents, and to experience family violence. With all that was accomplished in earlier waves of feminism, why does it feel like we are taking one step forward for two steps back? What are today's challenges as they relate to women in particular?
I think maybe it's because, as you say, we're not celebrating success because we have changed the majority consciousness. All of us have done this. And what that means is that now there's a backlash from the old consciousness. So it's not as if it's necessarily going back, but it's because we wouldn't have a backlash if we hadn't had a front lash, right? So however, the backlash could win. I mean, nowhere is it written. It's not automatic. So, it's a mix. It's partly that we have a foreshortened sense of time, so we don't understand that really speaking, no movement deeply, permanently changes society unless it lasts about 100 years. And we're in, say, 40 years into this one.
Yeah.
That was true of the abolitionist and suffragist era, and it's true of this era as well. So, here's the thing. I think we move forward like a spiral, not like a straight line, but we repeat similar circumstances, and we think, oh, God, here's this again, and so on. And then suddenly we look back and say, oh, really, we've come quite a long distance after all. But we shouldn't expect a straight line.
Well, it's so interesting because in the last month or so when I knew that I was going to come here tonight, I talked to a lot of women and I said, what would you like me to ask Gloria Steinem about? And that was exactly the issue that they wanted to talk about. Women of my age who said, what do we do to make sure that young women who are 20 to 25 understand what the feminist movement was all about? And heaven forbid we use the word again, because I remember during our provincial election when people started talking about health choice and reproductive choice and using all the euphemisms about conscience rights and all of that and these sorts of issues, that I remember thinking to myself, well, I'm sure that there'll be sort of a reaction from people as to why this is troubling. And the reaction came from people who were my age. People who, young women particularly, it's not just a generalization. I saw it over that 28-day period, who were 20 to 25 years old, who'd grown up with choice, had not experienced what life was like before that. And so I think it is important for us to be able to learn from the history, not to relive the history, not to fall back into it, but just, as you said, to remember, I like that it does take 100 years to make the change, because you will continue to have people that believe that it's possible to move that clock backward. And I do believe we have to be vigilant on those issues and to teach our daughters and our sons the importance of those issues, of equality, to teach everyone those.
Yeah. I'm sort of torn about it because I think young women are not recognized for how activist and smart and amazing and feminist and revolutionary and, that you really are, right? Yes. So it's true. I just think we express it in different ways because whereas I saw women dying from illegal abortions, that was, young women haven't experienced that, but what they have experienced is the highest rate of unwanted pregnancies in my country and any developed country in the world, abstinence-only sex education, just horrendous. And they're mad as hell about that. So I think we just need to listen to each other because they may be very angry about slightly different things.
Yeah.
And actually, it's maybe not such a good thing that all the reproductive rights organizations in my country, except one, are run by women who are no longer of reproductive age. So, so on those grounds alone, we should.
Okay, final question. Imagine you could trade positions. So Gloria Steinem is now our premier. And Alison Redford is traveling the world sharing the message of equality.
I have to say that I think you could be me much better than I could be you. I think it takes much more skill and diplomacy. And see, the good thing about being me is that nobody can fire me because I don't have a job. Nobody can diselect me because I'm not elected.
I want your job.
So what would you do? What would be the first thing you would do if you were to switch roles?
Demand a recount.
Well, I'll say that the one thing that this reminds me of a little bit tonight, and it's been wonderful for me, is we actually found a person that we know in common from South Africa, who's an incredible leader, and Gloria says that she's now heading the South African Human Rights Commission. And I think often that the one thing that I wish I had more time for, which I don't have the time to do as much of outside of our borders as inside, is to spend time staying connected to what international rights activism looks like. Now, that's not to say that there isn't an awful lot of work to do in Alberta with